to Travel Fuels Life, the show where we share stories, tips, and inspiration to help you live a travel lifestyle. I'm your host, Drew Hanisch, and have you ever thought about moving from your country of birth somewhere else across the globe and really immersing yourself in that culture? Well, that's something that I've been kind of interested in. The first time I went to Czech Republic, which is actually a country of my family's origin, I fell in love with the place, and it did cross my mind a couple of times that wouldn't it be cool to move here and actually really get to know the place? So there's a lot of logistics and things you have to consider if you're going to be taking a big leap in your life like that. And I wanted to talk to somebody who's actually done that. So my guest on the show today is Pete Collman. He is the co-host of the Bohemican Podcast. And for those that don't know a lot about Czech history, Bohemia is what that region around Prague was known as before it became Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. And Pete and his co-host Travis Dow go all into Czech history, and they talk about Czech culture. And after I did my trip around the country, I actually was talking to my brother about an event that happened while I was there that we'll cover during this episode. And he said, "Oh, there's a podcast you should listen to because he's probably got the answer to the question that you're talking about." And so that's where I learned about Pete, and then found out that here's a guy who is from the U.S., who's moved over and become an expat in Prague. So I wanted to have him on the show and have a chance to pick his brain about not only becoming an expat and how he got to this point in his life, but also the experience since he's been there, and also find out a little bit about the Czech Republic itself. So if you decided that you wanted to travel there, we'll talk about some of the hidden gems that are around, and we'll talk some about the culture, and we'll learn a little bit of history, and maybe a couple of things that you didn't know about a city that everybody seems to have a lot of information on, Prague. There's some things that I learned about on his podcast that might be interesting for you to check out next time you head there. So without further ado, let me bring on my guest, Pete Collman. Pete, welcome to the show.
Hi, Drew. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you are coming to us from, it's nighttime there. It's sunny. The sun is beaming in on me right now, but you're at the end of a workday there in the Czech Republic, aren't you?
Yeah, actually, it's more into the evening time here, and no more sun for sure. It's pretty dark.
I want to talk to you a bit about being an expat, because I haven't really had a chance to have somebody who has moved to a different country than their country of origin and get into the whole conversation of, first of all, how you get to that decision, and then how you actually, the logistics that you have to go through to make that work. So when did you first have this spark of an idea? First of all, where are you from? You're from the U.S., I'm guessing.
Yeah, I don't know if you can really tell with an accent, but yeah, more Mid-Atlantic, I guess. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. Went to college in West Virginia and also in Michigan, and then lived in Atlanta for about 13 or 14 years before I moved to Czech Republic. One of the reasons that I moved was both my kids are Czech American, so I wanted to be over here. Their mom's over here, so I wanted to be part of the raising process, and to do that, we all needed to be in the same city. So made the big decision. Now, for me, it's a little bit different because I'm a person living with a disability. I've got a spinal cord injury, so as a wheelchair user, oh my goodness, that's a whole new wrinkle
right.
to what you think about becoming an expat. That you're leaving the safety zone of what many people in the disabled community around the world look at, as in the United States, as the shining city on the hill when it comes to accessibility. So, you kind of take a deep breath saying, okay, what am I going to have to struggle with? But, you can make things work. And, Prague is not known to be a very accessible city, but you can make things work for you, and with some adaptive equipment and knowing ways around and Definitely driving a car over here is mandatory in a lot of ways. If you're in a wheelchair user, if you're not, public transportation is fantastic. But these are all of the things you kind of put together when you become an expat. For me, I never really liked the moniker of expatriate. I'm an American through and through. There's no way for me to really hide that in a lot of ways, for the good, bad, and the ugly. But there are plenty of people that I work with that are expats, and they're fine with that moniker because it's they felt like they wanted to either leave behind the United States, they're a citizen of the world, whatever that means. Right. There's a lot of different reasons why people come over to Europe or to Asia, and once you kind of I would say there's a honeymoon stage of about 3 years, 2 or 3 years. And around that, after that point, you start getting a little cynical about, what you're missing from the States and what, bureaucracy you have to deal with in this new country, and always feeling like a foreigner. All those things kind of really weigh on your shoulders. But, you get to the point where you kind of get through that third or fourth year, and this becomes home. I'll always have home in my heart with the United States, but Prague has become a second home for me, for sure.
Yeah. Well, how often do you have to come back to the U.S.? Because if you're going to keep your citizenship, I suppose there's a certain amount of trips that you have to make back to either reestablish yourself, or how does that work?
Well, I don't think there's a time limit that I know of. It used to be in the past that people would always have one passport, one citizenship, but now those rules are more relaxed, especially in the United States. You can have two. A lot of people, wind up having dual citizenships in different places. That makes it easier in a lot of ways. I'm a permanent resident through my son, who's a citizen of the Czech Republic. He's also an American citizen because he was born in Atlanta. So as a parent of an EU citizen, every 10 years I have to renew my permanent residency. So if that's up to date, I can pretty much go back and forth whenever I want, and it can stay in whatever country as long as I want, which is great. I personally try to get back, once every 2 years is what I can afford, but to see my family and my friends, I find those 2 year spans are hard to reach sometimes, and they're very necessary to kind of get back and reconnect.
Well, I'm sure with the accessibility issues as well, flying across the Atlantic is not an easy journey for you to make.
It's not too bad. Once you kind of get the situation with knowing how to travel on a plane as a wheelchair user, it becomes normal. I do a YouTube show on wheelchair travel around the world, and I usually find trains are the hardest thing for me because you never know what you're going to get with those. But boats and ferries can be challenging. Actually, airplanes are probably the less issue that I've got. All of their forms of transportation.
Wow. All right. So you said that you also work with some people who are expats. So in their case, how do you start this journey? Do they have to have a job, some kind of employment already, or somebody vouch for them if they don't have a family member that's in the country already or who is a citizen of the country?
I know. I of course came over as with a family situation, and so it was a little bit different. I would say probably easier in some respects. But if you do get a job over here, we'll say that you come over without one, you've got 3 months, 90 days to kind of get your stuff together and figure out what you want to do. Hopefully you can line up a couple of interviews. And then once you get a job, you'll be on a work permit. So just like in the States, you'll be, people that come over to the United States as non-citizens have a work visa. You'll see that a lot in folks that come from India or from Asia or even from Europe. That fill a lot of the tech sector jobs or some of the medical sector jobs that we have in the United States. There will be limits that you have as far as all contingencies based on your employment. So that's part of the deal. I think when you come over, there's that kind of sort of mystique when you talk about Prague with Americans. It comes down to the idea of you're a college student, you want to backpack across Europe, you you go to Prague, you kind of get that Kafka sort of feel. You live on someone's couch for a month or two, and you run out of beer money and you go home, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of us here that treat a little bit more mature aspect of things, of starting families here or trying to invest in being here long term. And you can do all those things. Some of the things that are kind of in the way would be, you might as well just forget about buying anything here, especially in the major cities. It's one of the highest costs of purchasing real estate in all of Europe is in Prague and some other big parts of Czech Republic.
Wow.
So renting is the way to go for the rest of your life. And, if that's the way you're going to do it, that's how it is. If you're going to be here for several decades, you might want to look into saving, some of your American money. It goes a long way here.
Mm-hmm.
And people do flipping. They buy some apartments if they, at really high dollar rates, they fix them up and then they rent them. So that's one way people kind of make money here, but it is challenging. The Czech koruna is not as strong as the dollar, and definitely not as strong as the British pound or the euro. So things go really quickly when you kind of leave the outside borders of Czech Republic with that kind of money. So you have to adjust. I think that's the key. You adjust your idea to get your mind off of what a dollar amounts to in the United States, and you kind of make those adjustments when you get here.
So how many trips did you take to the Czech Republic before you said, hey, I want to make this my home?
I had come here quite a bit. I would say from 2004 through to about the year that I moved over here in 2011. And, I kind of got the lay of the land, and I really like the history of Prague. And there's a very unique beauty here that I think anybody who's been to Prague, they would totally agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
In the winter, it's beautiful. In the summer, it's beautiful. In the fall, it's beautiful. The spring, everything is just fits the mood of this town. And if you get more and more comfortable with the situation, you explore the rural areas and the different regions of the Czech Republic, of the nation. And for me, when I get a little homesick of America, from America, I go, hey, you know what? I'm going to go down to Šumava, which is the big national forest south of here, about 2 hours south of here.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like Virginia and Ohio. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. And it kind of really brings back those feelings about the States and some of our beautiful parks we have back home. But I would suggest people coming here first before you start making ideas to move over someplace. It's always a good thing.
Well, I was going to say those red rooftops are the first thing that really draw my eye. I think part of what got me the first time I went to the Czech Republic is that I have seen pictures of Western Europe my whole life, almost ad nauseum. You're just so used to seeing the type of architecture and just the whole feel of the place. And it really does have a completely different feel to it when you go to the Czech Republic.
It does. Germany is neighbors here. Austria is neighbors here. Poland's neighbors here. And those countries do feel very different when you cross the borders in their architecture. Of course, when you get close to the borders themselves, you start, feeling, more of the German architecture you see, or the Austrian architecture near Vienna, and maybe the Moravian city of Brno. But I think Prague really stands unique. And part of that is Prague was very lucky that only other than having really one or two bombing disasters here during World War II, it was unscathed, which is, very unique, for World War II Europe. So what you see here is really a collection of different eras of architecture, all living and coexisting with itself. And, that's kind of your thing when you come to travel, you want to get into that kind of history. Mm-hmm. Boy, you really have a playground here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I just walking across the Charles Bridge and then seeing the architecture on the west side as you're walking down through, I don't know what that main drag is through there, but just you start smelling the smells and just kind of getting into that whole mystique of the place.
Yeah, Christmas time is interesting because, if you listen to the Bohemican Podcast, we every year we do a Christmas episode that's unique about Christmas. And one of those things is the dish of fried carp, that is a tradition here. And it's something that's interesting. You can walk downtown on Christmas Eve, and the whole place is just awash with that fried fish smell, which is a really nice smell, by the way. It's a nice smell, but everyone's doing it.
Nice.
So, there's definitely some unique sort of touches that are uniquely Prague, uniquely Czech, and I don't think if you come here, it's definitely going to make an impact on you.
Yeah. So, having some heritage myself, I mean, that gives me kind of a connection and makes me want to go there. And like the Astronomical Clock is actually in our family history. My dad did some research on it and found that he could never pinpoint whether our family member helped design the clock or if he was just somebody who helped build the city hall that the clock was in. But
Wow.
our name's actually associated with the Astronomical Clock. So that was something I really wanted to see. And I've been to Prague twice. And the first time I went, it wasn't under construction. The second time I went, it was all covered up. So I was really happy that I saw it the first time. Is it still covered, or have they finished working?
I was just going to say this fall, they are middle of the summer. They finished that completion, so it's bright and shiny.
Nice.
and great for photographs already. And that's what 2019, 2020.
Well, the other thing that I've gone twice to see and I have yet to get in there is the museum. Is that open up?
Oh, yeah, sure is. And by the way, it's wheelchair accessible except for one step to get in.
Oh, nice.
You need some assistance to get in from the curb to get into that. But they have an elevator, 2 lifts, and another elevator, and you can go to the very top overlook on top of the tower there. But yeah, it's a little bit of history with that because you brought this up. I think that's a great family history story. Mm-hmm. Most likely, the legend is that the original clockmaker who made the clock was considered to be a liability by the town burghers, the ones that ran the town. So they had his eyes gouged out with hot poker. That's the legend. But his son helped him take out one part of the clock that so it wouldn't work. And the reason why they wanted his eyes gouged out was because they didn't want other cities in Central Europe to buy his services to build a similar clock other places, because this was going to be something amazing for people to come to Prague to see. And he took out that part, and for about, I believe, 60 or 70 years, if not more, they couldn't get it to work. So maybe your ancestor was the guy that was trying to figure out how to put it back together.
That could be. We have to dig a little bit more into that. But it's listening to your podcast, I did not have a chance to go to underground Prague, and I bet you that most people don't even know that exists, that underneath that town square there's a whole underworld there.
It is. It's got many different sort of eras that it represents, and for one, it was used in, I would say, post 14th century or so, that I could know that there's some parts that were used. There were torture chambers there. The Battle of Bila Hora in 1620 was basically the benchmark of Catholicism that was going to beat out independent Protestant folks, and really started the 100 Years' War. Now, why I'm bringing that up is because the 27 noblemen that financed that revolution that lost were all under the ground in Old Town Square in these torture chambers, imprisoned and tortured, but not to death yet, because they all had to have a show trial in 1621, in the summer of 1621, to be executed in front of thousands, to show that that's what you don't do against power. Wow. So those torture chambers were real. Mm-hmm. And if you fast forward into the communist times in the 1950s, a lot of those tunnels were all filled with trash, or they were all kind of boarded up or bricked up because people that were against the communists were kind of using them to get around town to cause issues or have underground movements. So there's a lot of political stuff that still goes on with those tunnels, but they do exist, and those tours are still given. So I would I'll put that on top of your list next time you're here.
Oh, absolutely. So now that you've been doing the Bohemican podcast for quite some time now, did you know about underground Prague before you started researching for the show, or did the show kind of lead you to start hunting these things down?
Well, I would say yes and no to a lot of the things that we would have through the course of our podcast. When I first started visiting here, I was just really drawn like a moth to a flame, all these great legends and history. And I was just fascinated by learning something every trip I came, every few years to come to Prague. And then when I moved here, I had that kind of base knowledge. And that's kind of what I was like, what can I do with this? So I met a coworker that wanted to start a podcast, and we both kind of put our heads together to come up with the Bohemican show. Mm-hmm. And I think that to answer your question, it fed on itself. So I'm always learning new things about being here and people. One of the shows I'm working on for 2020 is working with some of the who's who of Czech culture. And there's just so many great historical figures that we haven't touched on the show in our 90 or so plus episodes. Emil Zetopek is the person we're going to do a show on next. Zetopek, if you're not familiar, was one of the best cross-country runners in Olympic history as a Czech. Mm-hmm. And his story is just amazing. I don't want to give away too much of it, but he wound up being a part of the Prague Spring in 1968. And he paid the price for speaking out against the communist regime as an Olympic star. He was stripped of his military honors or rank and became a trash man, basically, under the new regime, but still was, revered for his courage and against the communists, his quiet courage there, and also his determination during the Olympics. So there are a lot of stories like that. And I think that the show kind of allows me to kind of go out and start digging deeper for people that are listening to the program.
So one of the fun stories I had, my last trip to Czech Republic, I decided that I was going to rent a car and I was going to drive around the country as much as I could in 4 days, which really didn't give me much time. So I just really hit the highlights that I could find. But something happened to me that I think you'll find interesting, because I actually listened to an episode of your show that helped me understand a little bit more of the history behind something that I just bumped into, which was it was the end of May, and I left Prague and I headed over to Karlovy Vary, and then the next day I drove down to Pilsen, which people recognize that name because of Pilsner beer. And sure, that's all I really kind of knew about the area. And when I got to my hotel, I was right on the outskirts of town, within walking distance. And as soon as I started talking, they said, "Oh, are you here for the festival?" And I said, "Festival? What festival are you talking about?" So, "Oh, well, there's a festival downtown. You should go." So, okay. So I go walking down the street, and I start hearing jazz music playing, and I'm like, okay, this is different. And then I start seeing red, white, and blue flags all over the place, and they're not the Czech red, white, and blue, but they're American stars and stripes. And then I see Jeeps in the street, and they're like World War II Jeeps. And I see all of these people dressed up in American military uniforms, and they're all Czech. And I'm like, what is going on here? I look over to the stage in the main square, and there's a stage that says, and I mean, I don't speak Czech, but I could tell that it said Liberation Day up at the top of
That's right.
And I said, well, this is very interesting. I need to find out more about that. And it was my brother, actually, that listens to your show, said, you need to listen to this episode because it's going to explain all about the history behind that. So it's a great story. So especially for an American traveler, can you relay some of that background?
Oh, yeah. Well, you lucked out because hitting that right on the time and you could walk down there. I've never, you know how it is when you leave your home, you have sometimes a greater appreciation, of course, of other cultures and other places around the world, but you also have a deeper understanding of where you come from and your history. And, when you go to Pilsen for Liberation Day in May, it's to remember and have remembrance of the American army, Patton's army, coming in to rid the area of the Nazis. Mm-hmm. And I tell you, it was to see, like you said, all these Czech reenactors dressed to the nines when it comes to like the exact bootstraps, the 1944 patches on their sleeves, and the type of jeeps and armored vehicles that they have, all authentic. They spend a lot of money on this, and that's their hobby, and they stay in character the whole weekend. And it really is interesting. They fly in these. Well, they were octogenarians, and now they're in their 90s, mid 90s or so, if there's any left. Former Americans and forces from Belgium that helped liberate the town. Mm-hmm. And they're rock stars, which is really, really interesting. These guys are just treated like royalty, and they never have to buy a beer, So
that's great. Yeah, for me, it was like there's only two places I've been outside the United States where I felt like I was at home, and Pilsen and the Czech Republic is the only one that has a foreign language where I could still feel like I was at home. It was surreal to be there and be seeing this after, we hear a lot of press about how the world doesn't like Americans and so on and so forth. And then to see something like that, it's encouraging. And it really is a unique kind of a feeling.
Well, the Czechs have a long memory. The Poles have a long memory. Of the two peoples here in Europe and Central Europe, those folks have great, strong connections with Americans. The Poles definitely, and definitely the Czechs. The Czech Republic was put together because of President Wilson. I drive down to work, near Wilsonova, which is the name of the road for President Wilson. He helped with T.J. Masaryk, the president of Czechoslovakia. His wife was American. So there's those connections of the creation of the state that go back. But as far as World War II, if we all remember our textbooks, the Americans got as far as Pilsen and liberated all these western parts of Bohemia. And Patton was like begging Eisenhower, okay, we'll be in Prague by tonight. And Eisenhower said, nope, we just got a film with Stalin. You're not going anywhere. And he was ticked. And, Prague had to wait a couple more days, and the Soviet army came in to liberate Prague. And there goes the Iron Curtain. So, Pilsen, what's great about we put it in the show is talking to all these Czechs that just remember, what it meant, because under communism until 1989, they weren't taught that they were liberated by the Americans. Isn't that crazy? I mean, it wasn't part of their discussion. So since 1990 or 1991, they've held this parade every year for the whole weekend, and they never want to let it go. That comes with flyovers. They have jets that fly over from the local Czech Air Force Base. You're talking thousands of spectators that flock to this area. So you're right. It really is a nice sort of shot in the arms, thinking that there's a big thankfulness that's still there.
Something else I found curious was when I hitched a ride with it was nice. I was staying in an Airbnb in Prague, and the guy who ran the Airbnb said, well, I'll just pick you up at the train station and bring you over. So we had a nice little conversation on the way over, and he originally was from from Karlovy Vary, and as we were chatting back and forth, I was talking about using English and what languages people spoke in Czech Republic, because it's in a very unique spot where it has its own language. It has Russia on one side, it has Germany so close, and Austria, and then English on top of that. And he brought up an interesting point that there's like a dividing line where those that are of a certain age were brought up under Russian rule, and so you will utilize Russian as a second language, but then the younger ones tend to be leaning a little bit more towards English. Is that what you're finding there?
I would say yes to a lot of that. If you're talking to somebody that was definitely educated before 1989. They were not really necessarily taught English. They were taught Russian. With their the Czech sort of revival of the 1890s, 1900s moved people away from only speaking Czech in the rural areas that their grandmothers spoke back then in the 19th century to more of a modern thing in combination with the Germans. Because you have to understand, this country's been taken over by so many people for so long.
Right.
The Austrian-Hungarians, and the Habsburgs spoke German. Mm-hmm. Then they had this little bit of time where they could speak Czech, and then Germany again kind of flexed their muscles in the new German state through both world wars, and then before you know it, you got the Russians coming in. So unlike when you go to Sweden, where they speak perfect English.
Right.
The Czechs in major cities, they do start to really do pretty decent in the English language. But I would say that the closer you get to Germany, you have more of a German sort of understanding. Closer to Poland, definitely you'll be able to speak a little bit of Polish. For instance, you might be able to say "Dobry den" is good afternoon. In Czech, but in Polish it dzień dobry. So it's a little bit of a difference there. But I think Czechs and Poles can actually understand each other, without too much of a hardship. Mm-hmm. But as an expat, it does help to kind of know, definitely some greetings. And I unfortunately, as I mentioned on my show, that's been the biggest problem for me. I think I'm going to blame age to that. In my mid-40s, that teach an old dog new tricks. It's really hard. Both my kids are bilingual. They speak and write Czech and English, and that's great. So I do take my son around quite a bit with me as my translator when I need it.
So can you order coffee and you're doing the basic stuff, or can you have like very simple conversations at this point?
Once I get into the simple conversations, things go haywire pretty quick. Okay. So, in Prague, speaking English is still very quite, it's usable in a lot of places, especially hospitality industries or restaurants. But once you get outside of Prague, then you got to kind of start working a little harder. It can be a little more challenging. But, that's the hard part about, being, like at the top of the show, we mentioned that sometimes it's tough when you live someplace and you feel like a foreigner. But I got to tell you, it gives you a whole new appreciation for people that come to the United States from other parts of the world, that their transition to become an American, it gives you appreciation for what they have to deal with. Yeah, and it gives you appreciation for a lot of us that have ancestors that came over, and what they had to deal with. It might be a generation or so before someone they feel completely Americanized, if you will, but I do have that appreciation now, because it can be a rough road to hoe, for sure.
So culturally, were there any things that took some time to get yourself adjusted to from the way you were living as an American? Yes and no. I think when I moved here in 2011, things became, very Americanized in here in a lot of ways. Or if you're from Great Britain, there's a lot of Brits here too, and Canadians. The shopping malls here, for the most part, are just as modern and amazing as they would be in the United States. There's several IMAX movie theaters here.
there's McDonald's and Burger King and Pizza Hut. And
Right.
if you want some really high expensive for Czech currency junk food from America, you can go find it. I do miss root beer. I won't lie to you. But the real beer here is fantastic. So I've become a beer snob living over here for sure.
Okay, so you drink Budweiser, I'm guessing.
I would never say that out loud here. I would say probably Czech Budvar, which is the original Budweiser. Yes. Česká Budějovice, in the little town south of here. They have a nice little trademark war between Budweiser and St. Louis. So, kind of interesting.
That was my first shock. I was actually in Austria, and I was eating in a German restaurant, and they had the little coasters that said Budweiser, but it was in a different script. And I was like, what is the deal with this? And that's when I learned that it was a Czech beer. And I got to tell you, it took me seeing that logo about 6 times before I finally said, okay, let me try it. Because the leftovers from thinking about what American Budweiser is like just was enough to keep me from wanting to try it. But
well, there's so many great beers here. There's a couple good ones here in Prague, of course. There's of course, when you were in Pilsen, the main headquarters for Pilsner Urquell is there.
Right.
That was one of the first Pilsners in Europe. So that's delicious, and it's probably known in the United States quite well. There's one here in Prague called Kozel, which is a name for a goat, and that's one of my favorite ones.
That's
I like
good.
That one.
That's good to know, because that's the one I fell in love with. In fact, while I was in Pilsen, maybe I was being a rebel and bucking the trend, but I had the Kozel dark beer there while I was there, because I'm a fan of stouts and porters. So that was a good one.
Yeah, that's great.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of the outside territories around Prague, because I know a lot of people know about Prague, and I had a lot of fun driving around the countryside and seeing some of the different areas. What would you say are some hidden gems around the country that really should get more attention than they do?
Well, Moravia, which is, if you're driving from Prague, you're going catty corner southeast as you're heading towards Vienna. That area there is called Moravia, and it is absolutely beautiful. It's a little bit more mountainous. The towns there are very, very bucolic and beautiful. There's so many great castles. That's one thing. In this entire country, this is a country of castles. There are ruins. There are castles that are still up to date and pretty well known that go back to the 11th century. I mean, it's there's just so many cool things to see here. As a wheelchair guy, I have made it my point of honor to, no matter where the castle is, if it's on top of a giant hill, I'll get as close as I can to it to take photographs.
Nice.
And I try to see new castles every summer weekend. I try to drive someplace, but there are wonderful little towns. I think you said did you go to Kutna Hora?
I did, yes. And I went to
the Bone Church, the ossuary?
Yes, yep. I went to the ossuary. Yeah. I was trying to think because it's just outside of Kutna Hora.
Yeah, it's in Sedlic. Yeah, Sedlic. It's just maybe about a mile or two outside of the town of Kutna Hora. It's basically an old silver mining town. Mm-hmm. So that goes back to the Middle Ages, and so these guys would be mining into the ground, and that became a very wealthy area. And the Bone Church that you described is a church that in the basement, basically, of it is all these stacks of skeletons of femurs and skulls and those type of things set up in chandeliers. It seems a little morbid, but if you get the idea,
very cool.
We're dying. Yeah, it's kind of cool though. It's there wasn't enough room to bury everybody, especially if they died by plague, which there were plenty of plagues in Czech Republic. I think the latest one was in the 1790s.
Wow.
And people would clean the bones and then they would stack them up and in pyramids or chandeliers or those type of things. So if you get a chance, you could definitely go see that. It's very interesting, macabre, but interesting.
Well, I was going to say what's interesting is that we, before we started recording the show, I told you that I have Czech heritage, and the town that my family comes from, Česká, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is the same town that the guy who arranged those bones came from, because his name, his name and the town he's from are both inscribed in the wall.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So the nice connection with that. Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's so many great places. You mentioned Karlovy Vary. It's a spa town that's west of here in Prague. We've talked about Šumava. It's absolutely beautiful. What's really cool about Šumava is that it's a national forest. All right. Now you think, okay, what's the big deal about a national forest? Well, when the Soviets came in here and they put in the government, it depends on who you want to talk to. It really was a coup. It really was a coup d'état in 1948. They messed with the election. They got communists in here. They didn't leave. So once that happened, they closed off that whole southwest part of the entire country. Closed it off completely.
Wow.
Nobody could live in it. Nobody could visit it. It was a buffer zone between a freer Austria and that part of West Germany. So it was untouched, and nature just kind of regrew, and it's beautiful. So today it's protected very well, and it's gorgeous because there's not much development down there, in part as thanks to the communist era. That might be the only tip that we give to the communists here. But yeah, there you go.
I was going to say there's some pretty cool spots too that I drove through. I went up to Dresden, and I went to the Terezin concentration camp, which was you talk about spooky and spine chilling at the same time. Went up to Dresden and then drove along the Elbe River back into the Czech Republic, and there's just some beautiful areas up there as well.
Oh, yeah, there really are. Yeah, you mentioned Terezin. Terezin is what's unique about Terezin is that it was a fortified town during the era of Marie Theresa, the very famous Austrian empress. And it was these kind of like 1700s, 1800s star forts that you might see in the part of the East Coast in the United States. Mm-hmm. And within the fort was a town. And this town became a fortified prison area when the Nazis came in, and they would take the Jewish population, that would be the artists, the musicians, the playwrights, the folks that made big names for themselves, and they would put them in there and let them kind of flourish, but within these walls for a little bit, and then things got bad. Then it became more of a not the concentration camps you would see in Auschwitz or in Mauthausen, but it would be a debarkation point for people to leave for those places. And the death of disease and everything inside those walls were pretty horrible. So with the good, you have the ugly. And I think that's also true with the city of Prague. There are so many really bad times here in the city, really blood-ridden times that were tough throughout its entire history. But you also have some amazing art that's been created or inspired here, and some great literature and wonderful people that came from this area. So you have a little bit of both.
Yeah, I think is it the Estate Theater? I believe that's the name of it. Is where Mozart had actually first performed his Don Giovanni, and they said he was so in love with the city of Prague because it was so musical,
right,
that everybody in the country could play music and appreciate it.
It's that beautiful lime green building in Old Town that if you remember walking by it, where Don Giovanni was first opened up, and he absolutely loved. I mean, every city claims to have him here. I mean, Vienna loves him, and of course, but Prague was one of his favorite towns, and the music here is amazing. There's always something going on in this town when it comes to culture and music here. And you'll see that during the holiday season. You'll see it in the middle of the summer. And the conservatories they crank out so many wonderful artists and musicians. So when you do get a ticket to the Prague Symphony or to see the Philharmonic, you're really going to be in for a really good show.
So I love throwing a little curveball at people sometimes when I interview them. So let's get into this for just a moment. Bohemian. But people will say, so what's your origin? And my dad did so many, has gone back so many generations that it's like, well, where's the stopping point? Where do we want to say how many generations back would I consider to be my lineage? So I like to tell people that I'm Bohemian, but Bohemia actually has a different connotation in today's society. Have you figured out how it got associated with shoeless artists?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is it's a slight connection to that. When we talk about La Bohème, which is the French version of the avant-garde artistry of, I believe, the 1890s, 1870s, 1890s, that would be the eras that you would see people kind of doing their own thing with pushing against the establishment. All right, so when we say that La Bohème or saying that you're Bohemian meant that you're, today we say, Birkenstocks and going to a lot of Fish concerts, maybe. I don't know.
Right.
Along those lines. Okay, so for our younger audience, maybe they get that, they don't get it.
Yeah.
But as far as Bohemian is concerned, there really is no strong correlation. It's just, it could. I'm just guessing at this point where the original transition from the nation state of Bohemia, of Czechia, how that would be equated to this movement. And I just think someone probably looked at Bohemians as possibly not falling into the category of falling into line or being outside of the influence of the inner circle.
Yeah.
So that might be the reason. There might be other people that probably could tell you more to that show, but it is confusing when you say the word Bohemian. What does that mean?
Right. Exactly. Well, good. Well, you handled that one. I didn't know whether you've ever covered that on your show yet or not. There's a subject for down the road, if not. Tell us a little bit, because you've given us a lot of history, and I know that's probably perked up the ears of some listeners here who not only love travel, but who love to learn about history and listen to podcasts about history. Tell us a little bit about Bohemican and some of the other podcasts that you're involved in, and how people can hear those.
Well, sure. Our umbrella LLC, our business, is called Podcastnik. Think of like Sputnik, if you will. And within that, we have about 9 to 10 shows that we do. My business partner, Travis Dow, who's now in Oregon, he's been back and forth. He grew up in Munich, but he's American and speaks German and English, of course. And so half of his shows are in German. About the American experience, which is great, reaching a whole new level of listener. Mm-hmm. We co-host a show called Alchemy, a history of alchemy, and Prague was one of the front runners of that science, if you want to call it maybe a pseudoscience, to later the foundations of the science of alchemical viewpoints. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Bohemican, and we've been doing that for a better part of a decade. So if you go to Bohemican.com or you go to podcast or iTunes, you can find it. We also have a YouTube channel connected to that. And the Bohemican show kind of deals a lot with the culture that I find interesting, the history, the people, the culture, the traditions, you name it. Anything that's Czech related to the experience I have as an American expat, we're going to kind of cover it. Mm-hmm. The newest endeavor that we're doing right now, which is taking all my time away from the Bohemican, is this show called Past Access. And boy, if I could put a plug out for that, mm-hmm. It's a YouTube show. They're about 30 minutes documentaries. Some are shorter, but it's about me traveling around Europe in a wheelchair to historic locations. And since your show's about travel, this is great for people that are disabled. That they can go out and still live life and experience going up to the Eiffel Tower. I'll show you how to do it. If you want to go to the Sacré-Cœur, I'll tell you what entrance to go to that at the top of the hill in Paris. You'll be fine. how to take a vaporetti in Venice without falling into the canal. I'll tell you how to do it. The show is pretty interesting. We finished our first season, and we had about 5 cities that we did, and I'm currently finishing our World War I look back on the First Great War. And I had been traveling around since 2014 to 2018 doing this story. So now it's taking me a year to basically get it all together.
Wow.
So yeah, hopefully people like that. That's on our YouTube channel.
Excellent. Well, I'll put all of the links to all of this on our show notes page for your episode here. And we'll take care of that. And also, do you have time for social media with all these podcasts you're putting out?
Yeah, the funny part about this is that when we say things like my staff at Podcastnik or Past Access or Bohemican, the staff is usually 1 or 2 people, and that's me included at that half. So
yeah.
I'm my own Twitter guy. I'm my own.
You do it when you can, right?
Do it when you can. I have a full-time job. I got kids. There's a lot of things going on. So like tonight, I'll be doing editing till about midnight or so.
Nice.
And then I'll go home. Go to bed, start all over again the next day. But that's how you do it,
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Jay Quee.
Oh, very good. Totally.
It took me 2 trips to Prague before I finally could remember that. And it was while I was in France that I was thinking, it was popping into my head, and I'm like, not now, dummy. You should have had that a week ago.
I know you missed it.
Yeah. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, Pete. Thank you so much for your time.
Drew, thanks so much, and I wish you all the best with your podcast endeavors, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Same here. Thank you. By the way, Jequi means thank you, and that's what I said to Pete there at the end of the episode. I didn't really explain that to you. He got it, but I know not everybody knows Czech. It was kind of nice to hear him say that he struggles with language, because I've been trying to learn French since I was in high school, and every time I go to France or Quebec, it's like I got to relearn it all over again. And it was really tough going to the Czech Republic and trying to remember their words, because even the simple phrases that they don't relate to any other language. So it's just very unique and kind of hard to hang on to, because I'm also very visual, and they aren't really spelled the way that they sound, and so that's a little extra challenge. So it was kind of nice knowing that I'm not the only one that struggles with that. If you go out to the show notes page of this episode, it is season 2, episode 4. I'm going to post some pictures out there, some from my trip around the Czech Republic, some areas I think that are wonderful to go visit. And so check those out. I'll have a picture of the ossuary that we were talking about there, the Bone Church, and also I have a link, because I did a little searching. I didn't want to overly commit my family's history and its connection to the astronomical clock, but I have a link there that relates to Master Hannes, I guess is how it would be pronounced, which is a name very similar in spelling to ours. And our research shows lineage in the Czech Republic, but we do not have a drawn out genealogical line to that specific person who designed that clock. But it's an interesting story, so I put a link to it out there on Travel Fuels Life on the show notes page. So check that out. You can learn a little bit about the history of that clock as well. So I hope you enjoyed the show, and until next time, safe travels, and thanks for listening to Travel Fuels Life.